Now let's come back to Nigeria's big story. The president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, has signed an executive order that looks to chase government oil and gas revenue out of the rabbit hole of the state oil company, the NNPC Limited. That's the big story, by the way. Now, that executive order number 9 was a package of reforms that will include a review of the Petroleum Industry Act and the existing expenditure on procurements from the midstream and downstream gas infrastructure fund. Kelvin Emmanuel is an oil and gas sector analyst and the CEO at Dairy Hills, and he joins me live from Abuja Studios to drill down into the latest development. Good evening, my friend. It's good to see you again on the Arise Exchange.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Happy New Year to you.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you in the new year. Now, do you agree that the latest executive order is a right step in the right direction?
Yes. You know, the executive order that the president has signed and that has been gazetted, you know, it's been in the works for a couple of months. I'll say it's been in the works for about 11 or 12 months. While I would say it's a step in the right direction, and I'll give the audience listening to us tonight a background. So the way PI is structured, the profit oil and gas, you know, typically when you declare your revenues from sales of the crude oil lifted, for production sharing contracts, from joint venture, unregistered joint venture, you get your ability to deduct your cost to income, and then you get your gross profit. Your gross profit deducts your tax oil. The tax oil, you get your net profit. And the last annual financial statement NNPC released, they said that their net profit was anywhere around 5.4 trillion. Out of that, before you declare dividends, sections 64(4) of the PIA provides for NNPC to remit 30% of that net profit before dividends are declared to what they call the Frontier Basin Exploration Fund, based on the sections 64 and 1 to 3 of the PIA, and sections 9(4) of the PIA, sections 9 subsections 4 of the PIA that establishes the Frontier Exploration Basin. So Frontier Exploration Basins are basically basins with no commercial deposits, and you have 6 of those basins in Nigeria. You have the Bida Basin, you have the Sokoto Basin, you have the Lower Chad Basin, you have the Dahomey Basin. You know, Dahomey runs all the way from Ghana, Benin Republic. It runs into Nigeria through Okitipipura River from between the borders between Ogun State and Ondo State. It runs all the way to River Niger and River Benue tributaries. You have the Komani Basin. Then you have the Lower Benue Tro, which is your Anambra Basin, your Anambra Imo Delta Depot Center. Those are the 6 basins you have in Nigeria. So the Frontier Basin Exploration Fund was supposed to provide 30% of profit oil and gas before dividends are declared, based on sections 9(4) and PIA, section 64, 1 to 34 of the PIA, to fund the development of these basins. But that has not been the case so far. You know, and then you have 30% before profit is declared that are supposed to be retained earnings for NNPC to manage itself.
Interesting, and I'm sure you remember. I'm trying to find, how did we get into this rabbit hole in the first place, in which we're now trying to dig out of it? How did we get into a situation in which we get government revenues stuck within the government agencies itself? Which is the goose that lays the golden egg. That's the NNPC. How did we get into this in the first place, in which fees and other things are being deducted by same government agencies? And where do those money go? Do you have any idea, my friend?
Well, you know, so some people argue and say that, look, 30% retained earnings for profit oil and gas before dividends are declared by their benefactor or principal shareholder is not a lot of money, considering that this is money he uses to do his operations and also money he can use to fund some of his capital expenditure. But then the question is, the real question we should be asking is, the revenues coming to NNPC, number one, are the cost to income too high? Number one. Number two, are the revenues coming to NNPC a true reflection of the revenues that should be coming to NNPC? And I'll give you a background of why I said that. when you consider the things that operators, that's joint venture partners, the commercial operators, complain about, considering that NNPC is both a commercial operator and a concessionaire, which is an anomaly because the position of a concessionaire is supposed to be in the hands of the NUPRC and not NNPC, that is now a company subject to Company and Light Matters Act of 2020, right? When you look at the issues, they say, for example, there are technical losses they incur, because when you bring crude oil to surface, crude oil, basic sediment and water, is taken to flow stations, their separation is done, and then they are able to measure at the lease accountability custody transfer units, LACT units. And then for the gas, for example, the gas, you have the gas that is trapped, that goes to those measuring flow meters. You have that goes to designated nodes and flow meters. You have the gas that is reinjected to do well optimization. You have the gas that is flared. For the gas that is flared, the penalties are paid by companies, right? And those penalties are paid into what they call the midstream downstream gas infrastructure fund, which is one of the funds that were affected by this executive order.
Yes.
So the president has basically said that all the revenues are accrued to the MIDGIF, right? The 0.5% accruals from sale of petroleum products and natural gas, and the gas flare penalties that goes to the MIDGIF fund is now going to go straight to the federation account, which means that he's basically saying that in the PIA review, they are going to review sections 52 of the Petroleum Industry Act that establishes the midstream and downstream gas infrastructure fund. Number one complaint. Number two, Nigeria is one of the only countries in the world that is producing crude oil and gas. And you have an industry 58 years old that lacks an electronic and automated hydrocarbon accounting framework. I say this all the time, okay, not just on TV. I say it, that the federal government of Nigeria does not know the accurate measurement of the crude oil, basic sediment and water, and natural gas that comes to surface on a daily basis. That's because it doesn't have wellhead meters. It doesn't have wellhead meters. The government is saying that the cost of wellhead meters are about 250,000 each. And those wellhead meters can be leased, and can be gotten at a fraction of the cost of, using alternative crude evacuation routes to move crude all the way to flow meters and then to vessels for evacuation.
Yes.
These are the issues that the operators are complaining about. So the question is all the crude coming to surface actually captured in the calculation and all the net-offs that are captured by, for one, the 6 revenue collection agencies in Nigeria, Federal Ministry of Finance, NMDPRA, NUPRC, Nigerian Revenue Service, and the concessionaire or the shareholder of the government in oil and gas sector, NNPC, and then the oil that is given to the partners, JV partners, PSC partners. Is it being accurately captured? Can we say it's accurately captured? Number two, you have a financing structure that is wrong. The financing structure is wrong in the sense that today, for assets that are owned by NNPC, they operate what they call financial and technical service agreements, FTSAs. They have several of those blocks where NNPC owns 100% through their upstream subsidiary, NEPL. They don't have the capital. So they usually go to vendors to come, contractors, invest, drill crude, trap gas, and then they, share that money through cost recoveries. Cost recoveries are paid to the contractors, and then the other crude oil and gas is given. But for example, on OML 98, which started production in 1976 and which was taken and returned back to NNPC in 2020, can we say that the condensates and natural gas liquids on OML 98 are actually remitted to the Federation? These are questions you have to ask, right? Then you also have the question of the fact that for assets that are not 100% owned by NNPC, that are JVs, right? The operators end up carrying NNPC because if, for example, they announce FID and say FID is $5 billion, NNPC does not have maybe 50% or 55% of it or 60% to contribute as a shareholder in that JV. The operators will carry NNPC and, they will structure what they call a modified carrier agreement, and then recover that cost over a period. Now, who is controlling the MACOM budget? They are what they call MACOM and OPCOM budget. MACOM budgets are management committee budgets, say, for capital expenditure. OPCOMs are operational committee budgets for operational expenditure. NNPC has a subsidiary called NUMS, Nigerian Upstream Investment Management Services, that approve those budgets. So if those budgets are not properly audited to be sure that the costs that are reported to the government and approved are the actual cost on the ground, then the government is losing.
Now, you see, when Mr. President approved towards the end of last year that NNPC's debt or so had been forgiven, in a manner of speaking, to the government, because there were remittances, whatever, that were to come to the government, but says it was, and folks were saying, no, why would they be? Do you think the government, President Tinubu's administration, is now taking a more holistic look at the NNPC and says, look, even the structure of the NNPC looks a little bit somehow, like you said, you're a concessionaire, you're an operator, you're everything in the industry, as it were. How do you think this revenue change, chasing the rabbit down the hole, is going to impact the NNPC and the industry? How do you think this will affect everyone?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's the elephant in the room. And I'll tell you why I said that. The last AFS that was released, they said their revenues were 45 trillion. And then they said that their cost to income on that revenue was about 76%, which is ridiculous, by the way. It's absolutely ridiculous. Because you say your revenues are 45 trillion, and then your gross profits subject to tax oil or tax by the Federal Inland Revenue Service, now NRS, is only about 12.4 trillion. And your net profit's about 5.4 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the fact that you have such a disparity and high cost to income shows you that the approval for Marcom and Opcom, for the cost recoveries that these joint venture and PSC operators are applying for carrying NNPC, because NNPC lacks the finance and cash to put up their own side of capital and operational expenses to run these assets, means that your cost to income is going to be insanely high. And even when you bring that money to the table, the government is not getting a huge slice of the pie. So the question is not even the gross profit and net profit. That's not the question. The question is, what is the cost to income? And the cost to income can only be addressed if the president takes a broader look at the sector and say, why is there Nigerian upstream investment management services that came from NAPIMS that controls cost, when you can apply Section 65 of the PIA and move from UJVs and PSCs to incorporated joint venture company model like NLNG runs, where costs are shared, FID is shared, and there is procurement is done in line with global best practices. So this is a question that the president needs to address.
So Mr. President's job is not done yet. Perhaps more executive order still needed in that particular industry. But let's look at the implementation of it. You talk about the expenditure from midstream and downstream gas infrastructure to be conducted in line with existing procurement laws, policies, and whatever that regulations that Mr. President was part of the executive order and the statement released in Abuja. Do you think this is beginning to turn the wheel, as it were, albeit very slowly, to a point in which the NNPC begin to be trimmed down to become this, the NNPC Limited? And then we begin to see the need to strengthen the regulators in the industry.
So these changes that the president has announced affect sections 9, sections 52, 53, 57, 64, 63, 102 of the PIA. So what it means is that the implementation committee that has been set has a responsibility to review the PIA and then, send an executive draft to the National Assembly for amendments of the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021, August 12, when it was signed. But beyond that, I think that I was a bit taken aback when I didn't see NUPRC included in the implementation committee, because why do you have the Attorney General of the Federation, Minister of Budget and National Planning, and Special Advisor who has practically doubled as the substantive Minister of Petroleum, which it doesn't make any sense, because the organogram in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria doesn't make any sense. For one, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu should not be Minister of Petroleum. He should not be Minister of Petroleum, if we're keeping it a buck. The decision that that we've made, where after Jonathan left, we have the president doubling as substantive Minister of Petroleum, is an anomaly. It doesn't make any sense. And where a special advisor is, in practice and principle, ranking higher than the sitting Minister of State for Petroleum and gas, it doesn't make any sense. Okay? So if you don't bring your regulator in NUPRC, NMDPRA
Yes.
to the table and include an implementation committee.
Yes.
A yeson that was unfairly removed by Melek Yari when he was there, she was unfairly removed. Is a very good and excellent pick for NUPRC. So, and she's a round peg in a round hole. The fact that you're not bringing her to the table and getting the inputs of the regulators that are going to implement any gazette you produce, it doesn't make any sense to me. You know, so I think that there are broader issues that needs to be addressed, right? You have to do a comprehensive review of Nigeria's petroleum fiscal regime when it comes to royalties, when it comes to tax, and when it comes to profit oil. You need to change the financing model. The government also needs to go to National Economic Council and approve for NNPC to go into a process of, you know, asset classification and evaluation that will begin the process of unbundling NNPC to the markets and initial public offering. And the biggest problem NNPC has is a governance problem. And that governance problem is the reason why its financing structure is wrong. And if the financing structure is wrong, you give room and hold for you to have situations, for example, like I said, where MACOM and OPCOM budgets are controlled by a Nigerian Investment Upstream Management Services, which is a very critical subsidiary in NNPC. And then you have an inflation, in my view, of cost. And then you have a situation where cost to income is as high as 76%, which doesn't make any sense. So at the end of the day, the pie that comes as gross profit,
Yes.
then that is debited to become net profit, that is subject to your 30% management fee for retained earnings to NNPC and 30% to Frontier Business Exploration Fund, isn't much at the end of the day. So out of 45 trillion, the government gets 1 point something trillion, and it doesn't make any sense. The president needs to go to where the issues really are and interrogate.
So the PIA, the Petroleum Industry Act, just 5 years after we onboarded it, is due. Do you think that's due for a comprehensive overhauling? And if yes, how should the government proceed with that? Is this committee that should do that job, or we should just throw it back at the National Assembly? Do you think we have the time between now and the elections next year to get it done?
So what you've had, and why you're saying that there's been an uptick in, in FIDs for Deepwater, Bonga North, Shell has commissioned Bonga Southwest in 2 phases, up to $20 billion. Bonga North was $5 billion. Ubeta and the likes of them is, number one, because of the divestment. And there are issues around the fact that the pre- and post-divestment liabilities of the sellers for those assets were, not properly structured in terms of remediation, decommissioning, and abandonment, And then it's also because the government has provided targeted subsidies for these operators, these IOCs. That's why you've seen them rush in, So, for example, you have the 20% tax credits that is given to operators who are able to reduce their costs. While that might work for deep offshore assets because they don't have the typical destruction of pipelines. It doesn't work for onshore assets, right? I don't think the regulators have operationalized the PIA as yet. I'll say if I'm going to score them, they've done maybe 25 or 30% so far based on the PIA. There needs to be a review of the PIA because there are contradictions. And one of those contradictions I raised earlier is the fact that NNPC was made both a concessionaire and a commercial operator at the same time, which doesn't make any sense. The role of concessionaireship is supposed to be resting with NUPRC, and you have a fantastic head, Yeson, that is now the head of NUPRC, and not NNPC. NNPC should be a commercial operator subject to CAMA, and NNPC should go to the market, and the NNPC should not be taking instructions from the State House. It's an anomaly. I mean, you say that the company is a company under CAMA, and then you send memos every day from Villa giving them instructions on what to do. It doesn't make any sense. The president should build a Chinese wall and hands off the operations of NNPC. Send it to the markets. Allow the shareholders of NNPC to appoint the board and management of NNPC and make commercial decisions that are viable. And I'll tell you why I said that. Look at, for example, I know we're not talking about refineries, but look at, for example, the government-owned refineries. Installed capacity, 445,000 barrels per day. Yeah, so far they've spent about $18 billion in turnaround maintenance, no results, the last of which was $30 billion. Port Harcourt does not have a catalytic reforming unit to a secondary distillation unit to convert naphtha into higher distillates. Warri has a CRU, but it's not functional. Okay, Warri is bringing crude oil feedstock by barges. Kaduna does not have a pipe to take crude there, and one of the CDUs in Kaduna cannot even process Nigerian grade crude, right? Now, NNPC, because of pressure, political pressure from the government, is talking about bringing Sinopec to do a partnership where to place cash calls to revive refineries that cannot even process crude and achieve up to 20% recoveries in crude compared to Dangote that is doing 57%. So if you don't have a situation where you've structured your governance and financial model to make pure sound commercial decisions devoid of emotions and political permutations, then they are bound to fail. They are bound to fail.
Very interesting point. And that's the point we're going to end it for tonight here. I'm sure there'll be a whole lot more time to discuss this into more details and perhaps further actions that you've recommended for the government as well. Thank you so much, as always, for those insights into the Nigerian oil and gas industry, key issues and development. Have a pleasant evening out there in Abuja. Kelvin Emmanuel, CEO at Dairy Hills and Oil and Gas Sector Analyst.